Shall we start?
Yeah.
Shall I introduce you?
Sure. Okay.
It just seemed like it was after an abrupt start. I thought you would say something in your introduction.
Oh.
So he is Arjuna. I don't think any of you have heard him before, have you? Yeah. So he's Arjuna, and he's been practicing Bhakti Yoga for about a decade now. And he is an electrician by profession. He's also a musician, and he really like, of course, he's very well versed with the philosophy of Bhakti Yoga, but at the same time he takes a deep interest in the scientific, in the scientific aspect of evolution, and how can I say it, like he really likes to take a scientific approach to Bhakti Yoga with the perspective of showing that how Bhakti Yoga is also science, and that how science is not necessarily, that how science as we know it can not necessarily be called science. Yeah, so he's always on loggerheads with science. So his perspective is like, science versus spirituality, and why does there have to be a gap? And especially going on the theory of evolution and consciousness. And
Maybe I'll say something about that. So I think science is great, especially, when I go to the dentist or get on an airplane or drive my car, then science is fantastic. But the problem is when, a lot of scientists are not good philosophers often, and they'll often have philosophical commitments which they'll take with them into their science, and that can make their views sort of biased. So the question we're going to be looking at today is, does the evidence support evolution? And of course, the theory is used to prop up an atheistic worldview or a materialistic worldview. And if it turns out that that's false, then it suddenly becomes rational to explore questions of a spiritual nature. So that's kind of the relevance. So, so the basic theory is the idea of common descent, that, the theory does not attempt to explain how the first life forms came about. That's called abiogenesis, and nobody claims to have a theory of how the first life came about. What the theory deals with is, once you have a living cell with replicating DNA, then you get neo-Darwinism is the term some people use for it. You get mutations acting on, you get natural selection acting on mutations, variations within the gene pool. If whatever organism has a survival advantage survives, and the other ones are deselected, the colloquialism for when somebody dies due to stupidity is they get a Darwin Award, based on this principle. So there's various evidences that are given for the theory. It's claimed the fossil record shows a progression of simpler forms to more complex, which is consistent with the theory. There's what's called the phylogenetic tree, where they examine the DNA of any fossil or any living organism they can, and then they break those down into trees based on similarities. So if someone's directly, another organism's directly related, they'll have the most DNA in common. And then the further back you go historically, the more variation there'll be. So they draw a tree up and they give that as evidence. They give genetic similarities between organisms, which I guess that kind of sounds like the same thing, but it's a little different because the phylogenetic tree is supposed to be showing a progression of ancestry, whereas genetic similarities, I guess it's kind of similar. Like we've got like 93% of the same genes as monkeys. Or maybe they're always changing the number. And it's said that suggests that we have a common ancestor. And then anatomical similarities between organisms. We'll get into that one a bit later, but there's a similar bone structure to an arm and forearm and fingers that you'll even see in birds. They've got like a bone here, a bone there, and some more bones here. And they'll say that shows that we have common ancestry. Junk DNA that still is used as a trope to support evolution, but more and more it's found that what they thought was non-coding regions of DNA actually serve a purpose. So they're thinking that the junk DNA is more like software or an operating system, whereas the DNA that they knew coded for things, coded for proteins. So on top of coding for proteins, it appears DNA does a lot of other things. And that was a prediction made by intelligent design advocates. Intelligent design is the competing theory, the idea that life did not arise by chance, but was curated by an intelligent mind. And then scientists have done computer modeling, which they claim simulates the mechanisms which the theory of evolution, which genetic structures face, the probabilistic resources and chances it face. They claim they've done that on computers. When we really look at it, we see they haven't exactly done that, because I've not seen a computer algorithm which modeled the actual probabilities faced by the mutation selection mechanism, which worked on when a computer punched it out. And it's not for want of computing power. There's really powerful computers these days. But how a genetic algorithm works, they are used in self-driving cars and various other things. What makes them work is having a very intelligent selection mechanism. So they'll produce, they'll start out with some software, or they'll produce it randomly, and then they'll have an algorithm which makes random changes to that software, and then they'll run that software compared to a bunch of other ones that have had random changes made to them, and whichever one performs best is selected. So that a simple example to understand is the bots that YouTube uses, and they randomly play videos to you. Well, the software that's used it's following an algorithm which we don't understand. Nobody really knows how it works. It works like a neural network, and nobody really knows how neural networks in the brain function either. You can't dissect somebody's brain and figure out what they were thinking at the time. There's no way of accessing that information. So the AI is like that too. They can't look at all the connections that these software have and how they're working and figure out what they're thinking and how they operate. But they can measure the results. So they look at one, and whichever one keeps you watching videos the longest, that one wins. And so YouTube has many bots that they'll put on people to, the whole goal of this thing is to keep you on your computer, on the app, as long as possible, which is a little bit dystopian. Not necessarily what we want people to be doing with their lives. But so that whenever they've made a genetic algorithm that was able to produce, genetic innovation simulating life, what they've done is they've had a selection mechanism which was highly intelligent and did not mimic what natural processes face. So like a human can have a goal in mind, like an intelligent mind can have a goal. You can be working towards a certain end, and you can see, what I'm doing is taking me in the direction of this specific goal. We can have foresight. But the natural selection which goes on in life is either live or die. And unless there's a survival advantage already existing or a survival disadvantage from a particular mutation, then there's nothing for natural selection to select. So you get things like, they call it neutral drift. So one point is that natural selection doesn't act on a trait, it acts on an organism. What that means is, say, what is it? They think grizzly bears evolved into polar bears. So say one of the grizzly bears was born with white fur. But that grizzly bear might also have been really scrawny and not good at fighting. So although it had the white fur, which is a survival advantage if you're living up in the snow, because then you can hide, not be as easily seen when you're hunting. But if that grizzly bear is also really scrawny, it's the one trait being advantageous will be trumped by the disadvantaged trait. And that could also be neutral. Like a lot of mutations will have really subtle effects which are not able to punch through the noise of all the other traits that are found in the organism. So whereas, an intelligent mind can select this is closer to a goal. Now, we wouldn't want to think about that in a genetic sense, because anyone thinking they should choose who's got better genes and who should reproduce is really evil. That's not something we want to think about. But, say with car designs, they can design a car and they can test it, take it on the road, and they can figure out, this car is not performing as well as this car, and they can figure out what trait it is. And, like say they produce a Jeep and it rolls a lot, they figure out why it's not rolling and they change it. And they can do that with algorithms to help them. They can have algorithms that simulate physics that do that. But the way those things work, like people who do AI, generate AI, they talk about how valuable it is having the selection apparatus. I don't know the technical terms for it, but the bot, there's the bot that randomly changes it. There's the bot that's being chosen or not chosen, and there's the bot that's choosing. And the bot that's choosing is where the real gold is. So someone who can come up with a bot or generate a bot that's really good at selecting which bots have advantages can make a lot of money. And it's not so easy to do, and you have to do it for each different optimization. Like one for self-driving cars will be different for analyzing medical data. So that's the computer modeling one. Yeah, like Richard Dawkins, I'm sure you've all heard of him. He wrote several books on the subject, and one of his algorithms, it's like that he did on a computer simulation which was supposed to model genetics, would select for things being closer to a gene which was being searched for, which you can't do. Like if you're trying to bust through a padlock, nobody's going to come and tell you over your shoulder, like, oh, you've got 4 of the digits correct, don't move those ones, you've got 4 more to go, keep these ones still. If somebody could do that every time you got a couple digits right, they're like, yeah, those ones are right, keep them there, then the lock would be really easy to break into. But if you need to get all 10 digits perfect before the thing will tug open and before you have any feedback whether any of them are right, then it's not feasible for you to break open the lock unless you're going to spend like 20 years doing it. I don't know the exact numbers. There's been that's given as an example, but I haven't memorized it. And then endogenous retroviruses. I thought I'd just mention the basic evidence that I'm aware of that's given for evolution. Endogenous retrovirus is they find genetic deformities or something that they think is from a virus attaching itself into the organism and then writing something. And if that's the case, if we've got these in common with monkeys, it suggests that we have a common ancestor who was infected with this virus. Now, I didn't bother to look up for a counter argument to that, but I'm happy to just say that's interesting evidence. Let's look at all of the evidence in total and see whether this piece of evidence is compelling when we look at all the rest of it. So can design be inferred? This question is really what's being asked is, if something is highly improbable by chance, can we assume it was put there? So one argument that's given is, suppose a kid walks out into his lounge and finds that alphabet soup letters have been arranged, are sitting on the dining table, and they say, clean your room, Mom. The kid's automatically going to assume that didn't happen by chance, that somebody put those letters there on purpose to give them a message. And when we do things like that, when we assume, no, this didn't happen by chance, somebody's arranged this, we're inferring design based on probability. We're just doing it intuitively. Like people, with the theory of intelligent design versus evolution, people write books on like, at what point can you say something was designed and couldn't have come about by a natural process? But in our everyday lives, we make intuitive assumptions about these kinds of things without anyone needing to tell us that you can infer design at this stage, but not at this stage. But in philosophy, you can't just assume things. Every little thing that we take as intuitive becomes psychoanalyzed and philosophically analyzed down to minute details, and you start to wonder why we would even question these things. Like if another example would be if a series of meteorites landed on the moon that spelt out "I exist, God" or something like that, or a verse in the Bible or something that is given as an example, how many atheists would be like, okay, that couldn't have happened by chance? Physically, it could have happened by chance. There's no physical law that prohibits meteorites from striking the moon in a way that spells out a phrase. But it kind of defies credulity to assume something like that happened without any intelligent oversight. So one argument that's given in reply to this is, but every event is improbable. I'll just play a quick clip of somebody making this point.
Let's get back to the question I asked you at the beginning and answer it obliquely. Given a fair six-sided die, what's the chance of rolling a 6? Well, that's obvious, it's 1 in 6. Okay, what about the chance of rolling 2 6s in a row? 6 to the power of 2 is 36, and so the chance is 1 in 36. The chance of rolling 3 6s in a row is 1 in 216, 4 in a row is 1 in 1296, and 5 in a row is a whopping 1 in 7776. But here's the thing, since each face of the die has an equal probability of coming up, 1 in 6, the chance of rolling any sequence, such as what we rolled at the beginning, is also 1 in 7776. My point is that when it comes to the argument from improbability, the man behind the curtain is the arbitrary significance that its proponents assign.
Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain!
They emphasize, for instance, that you are the result of one sperm out of 100 million. But the brute fact is that whatever sperm won the race could argue all the same. In 1913 at the Monte Carlo casino, roulette gamblers lost millions of francs betting against black, reasoning that since black had come up 25 times in a row, the chance of black coming up a 26th time is 1 in 67,108,863. What they didn't realise, however, is that the chance of black coming up 25 times in a row and then red turning up is also 1 in 67,108,863. They, just like the proponents of the argument from improbability, arbitrarily assign significance. To conclude, in interest of being brief but efficient, we've here covered just one fallacy committed by the argument from improbability and 2 fallacies very commonly committed by...
So that's quite a common argument, and what he's missing is that although every, like you can look up at the night sky and if a shooting star goes past, the chances are there'll be a shooting star at some point in the sky, but there being one and that exact precise point is highly improbable. But what that's missing is there's the difference between what's called Shannon information, a theory of information devised by a scientist called Shannon, and what's called specified information. So Shannon information is just how unlikely is a particular combination, and you can mathematically, you can rigorously describe it mathematically how unlikely something is. So like you have 10 digits in a lock combination. Every single combination you produce out of that will have a high improbability of coming up, but only one of them is going to open the lock, and that's what's meant by specified information. So if you want to randomly pull letters out of a bag and put them on a whiteboard, any combination you produce will be highly improbable. But the chances of producing one that's an intelligible phrase in English is incredibly unlikely. So basically, and with the same argument that he just gave there, you can basically destroy statistics. Because you can argue against any statistical conclusion by giving that as an argument, which doesn't really get us anywhere. The fact is, if something is statistically improbable, like if someone's solving a murder and they figure out this could not possibly have been achieved by the suspect, then they'll just throw it out. Like, if something's that unlikely. I don't have a ready example for that, but they'll do it in investigations all the time. They'll look for something that's within credulity to assume happened. So I don't see why we should treat the origins of life or evolution any differently. If it's if you look at the chance of a protein forming, there's different numbers that people come up with, but I'm pretty sure all of them are improbable. So you have a chain of amino acids which is 150 to 300 long, and then you assume that there'll be a variety of proteins that'll serve the same purpose. It would be like if a combination lock had 1,000 combinations that would open it, but it had 20 digits. So you put the total number of proteins in existence that could possibly do the job compared to the total number of combinations of amino acids you could achieve of that same length that won't do anything. You punch that number in. Some number they come up with was 1 in 10 to the 72nd of getting a protein. And to put that in perspective, they think there's 1 in 10 to the 60th atoms in the universe. And I'm not that sharp on all the numbers, but one way they calculated, then you have probabilistic resources, which is another thing. So one question is, how unlikely is something to happen on one chance, given one opportunity? But the other question is, how many opportunities are there? So this is called probabilistic resources. So, if you lock up your bicycle outside and you come in here and you know that there's somebody standing on there trying to open the combination, and you've got 4 digits. 4 digits, there's 3 digits, you get 1,000. 4 digits, I guess you get 10,000. So let's say it's 10,000. Like, once when I was a kid, I lost the combination for my 3-digit code, and I thought I went through half the combinations, and I didn't get it, and I gave up. So I gave it to another kid at school and offered him $2 if he could figure out the combination for me. And he brought it back to me the next day, and he'd worked out the combination. But there's 3 digits, I guess 0 to 9, so you got 1,000 opportunities, 1,000 possible combinations. So you can sit there for a couple hours and you go through all of them, right? So if you got 4 digits, it's now 10,000, right? So at 10,000, there's a faint possibility, maybe, that somebody, if they spent several hours, could get it. They'd have to be lucky. But if you had 10 digits, nobody would even be concerned for a moment that somebody would steal their bicycle, right? You'd just be like, yeah, let them try, good luck. So this kind of puts it in perspective. Like, his argument is a little weak because, sure, any combination that the bike thief comes up with is unlikely. That's right. But he's going to come up with a number of combinations. Why not the ones that he does end up coming up with? There's nothing special about the ones that don't unlock the bike lock. He's going to come up with some, and the ones that don't unlock the bike lock are not any different from one another in terms of what they actually achieve. You get the same outcome. So it doesn't really matter which ones they come up with that don't open the bike lock. Any ones will do. So to say that all the attempted combinations are unlikely is just sophistry. Sophistry, it means it sounds logical. It's rhetoric, strong rhetoric, but if you actually break it down, nothing valid has been said. Sophistry is used when somebody's kind of pulling the wool over people's eyes using logic. It sounds convincing, but if you really break it down, they're just cheating you. Come back to the presentation. So I've covered those points. So here's a quote from Stephen Meyer, he's got a PhD in philosophy of science, and he heads up the Discovery Institute, which spends a lot of work showing how the theory of evolution is on shaky ground. We can detect design when we recognize that a complex pattern of events has a functional significance because of some operational knowledge that we possess about it. For example, the functional requirements or conventions of a system. If I observe someone opening a combination lock on the first try, I correctly infer an intelligent cause rather than a chance event. Why? I know that the odds of guessing the combination are extremely low relative to the probabilistic resources. The single trial available. But beyond that, I recognize, based upon my knowledge of how locks work, that the person has produced a functionally significant outcome, and so I conclude design. Is anyone not convinced that we can use probability to infer design in genetic organisms? I mean, another point to make is the counter argument would be when the kid finds the alphabet soup on the table, he knows a cause that can create that. He knows that his mum lives in the same house and has likely been in that room recently and is capable of arranging letters in a way that produces that outcome. Whereas if we look at genetic organisms and we infer an intelligence behind it, we don't know that any intelligence exists which is smart enough and has the power to arrange genetic information like that and to arrange matter like that to produce a living cell. That would be the counter argument. The problem with that counter argument is we can use a parallel argument to defeat evolution. So evolution fits into a category called a historical science. And historical sciences, they work in the same way that a crime investigation might work. It's something that's happened in the past, and we have to infer based on evidence that's presently available to us what happened in the past. So historical sciences work by studying causes now in operation, which we know are capable of producing an effect which we've measured. So a good example would be volcanoes. Where they dig through sediment and they find layers of ash, and they assume, based on that, they say this city was buried in ash. A volcano happened about so many centuries ago. We have modern examples of that. Volcanoes go off and they produce the same type of ash. So that's an example of historical science using a cause now in operation to infer backwards to a previous event and what caused it. In the case of the theory of evolution, they're also inferring something which hasn't been observed. Nobody's seen a monkey turning into a human, or bears turn. Yeah, I think bears turned into whales, maybe cow, whatever it is. It's some kind of land mammal turned into whales. Nobody's seen that happen. What we have seen is that genetic mutations happen, and they're either beneficial or detrimental, but we haven't seen them stack up on a scale large enough to produce that. So, for example, we have something called gene regulatory networks. They're the part of our DNA which codes for our body plan. So when an organism's developing in the womb, or whatever it is for other creatures, these genes are coding for where each cell goes and how long they divide. So like dogs will have a mutation in an area that codes for snout length, and then you'll get a dog with a shorter snout, and so on. What they find is mutations to gene regulatory networks which change things too much are always fatal. There's no recorded example of a genetic change which is capable of generating a new body plan or a novel body plan which isn't fatal. So one scientist in commenting on it said, if you're too early, it's fatal, and if you're too late, then you can't make the changes necessary. So when do you get into the genes in order to create a new body plan? The mutations we have observed don't take place at a level capable of generating new body plans. They're superficial things like, hair color or bone density, or how tall a creature is or short. Like, they breed sheep to be more furry. But and then selective animal breeders, they'll do this. They want to sell wool, so every time they have a furry sheep, they'll also breed it with the other most furry sheep until they have, some really furry sheep. and then they can make more money selling wool. But what they find is if they're ever selectively breeding, like faster horses or whatever it might be, or cows that produce more milk, if they get an organism which is too far strayed from the pack, it always ends up being infertile. There's clear boundaries on how far you can go with breeding before you get what's called reversion to the mean. So they have taken fruit flies, and one of the scientists who did a lot of the research on mutating fruit flies said like they'd exposed them to a drug which causes mutations at a higher rate. And every time they thought a fruit fly had a survival advantage, they'd release it into the wild. And every single time they did that, the fruit fly would die out. They'd get reversion to the mean, which means that the general population selects back to normal. The same thing happens with antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So when antibiotics are exposed to when bacteria is exposed to antibiotics, there'll be some of them that mutate in a way that gives them an advantage. That means that they're not killed by that antibiotic. And as long as they're exposed to the antibiotic, the ones that are immune to the antibiotic will thrive. That's why you get superbugs in hospitals. But if you take away the antibiotic and put them back into the wild, you get reversion to the mean. The ones that are resistant it comes at a cost. The advantage for being antibiotic resistant changes other things. It doesn't just change that one thing. And it comes at a cost, which means that when they're not in that situation where they need that mutation, then they'll be disadvantaged, and which is kind of good news, because it means if we stop using antibiotics, then they'd start working again eventually. Or if we use them sparingly, they'll work when we need them to. Yeah.
Is it better now?
Yeah, now it's good. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, if you've made a very convincing argument that works to debunk evolution. However, are you saying if all you can do is debunk evolution, do you I know obviously you have your idea, everybody has their idea. There are so many ideas out there about how the world was created, whether it was the Big Bang, whether it was creationism, different types of creationism. Are any of those theories more likely than the other? Is there a scientific theory? Is creationism or by design more likely than some scientific theory that hasn't been thought of yet or hasn't been discovered yet?
You mean could there be another atheistic theory that supersedes evolution?
Yeah, because I see, I get the probability leans toward design, but the way when you have the counter argument and then you counter the counter argument, that if there's another scientific theory that couldn't be countered in that way,
Well, we'd have to see the theory and look at it.
Yeah,
I mean, it's always possible that another theory would come up, but like theists get accused of God of the gaps, which is, anywhere science can't explain something, you just insert God. But they're doing the same thing. Anywhere they can't explain something, they just insert naturalism. They just assume, or you could also call it future scientists of the gaps. So anywhere we don't have a materialistic explanation for something, we just say, in the future, scientists will come along who will have an explanation. It's okay, but you can just say that to anything.
Yeah, but there's not there's not a theory that is more. There's not. You can't for sure say design. You can't for sure say one version of a design theory.
Well, you can say this is the best explanation we have out of all the competing explanations.
This one, another thing called matter and energy same according to Einstein.
Yeah, quantum physics.
Right? So this theory is stated in a sutra called Auckland Sutra, and it says so we have an aura, which is kind of a magnetic field surrounding us like light. So when we get our body destroyed, this field of energy goes somewhere and reborn somewhere or something like that. So this theory says in the first life form occurred in this earth, so that kind of floating energy field came to the earth and then it materialized. So this materialization means basically this aura, floating aura, which is the energy, comes to the earth and interacting with the mud, watery mud in the earth. So basically, it converts the E to the M. So basically, energy to the matter in a form. So this, according to this according to this energy field, which will have aura without the body, which rotated around the earth and interact with the matter like the mud, and it penetrate and generate some small amount of atoms. So this materialization made the first kind of living cell. This is one another thing,
Right.
which agrees with kind of for me.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. So with what, like, one point I could make out of trying to understand your question is that with science you can kind of point to something metaphysical. You can say there's something. One Christian apologist talks about, he was a cold case detective for 20 years working for the police in America. And so all his crimes had been like 20 years not without being solved, and he'd get these cases and try to solve them. And the first thing they do is they try to figure out if they can explain a crime scene without going outside the room. If they don't have to go outside the room, it means there's no foul play. But if they figure out, no, somebody was in here and they did something, then they've got an agent which is culprit. So he uses this to explain, but we can look at science and different things and say, no, there's something more than, like, we're in this material world, that scientists say is all there is. We can look at science and say, no, that can't be all there is, because there's certain effects we find in the material world which tell us there's got to be something else acting on the material world. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering, like out of genuine curiosity, is there more proof for something else?
So I mean, like a competing, like another materialistic theory for evolution, for how life came about, other than neo-Darwinism. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Is there more proof for
So that, like, in 2016, the Royal Society in England hosted a convention where they got together a bunch of leading evolutionary biologists and so on, and the main topic was neo-Darwinism, which basically means the mutation selection mechanism that we spoke about earlier, that random mutations are acting on the genes and they're being selected. They were saying how this is actually inadequate. There's so many problems with it. So they got together, they talked about the problems. This is another thing which is really interesting, that the theory of evolution, that the scientists have two faces that they'll present. There's the face that they showed in this conference, and then there's the face they show to the public. So to the public, it's all Darwin all the time. But when they have this little convention, they're like, actually, we've got problems with this theory. It's not adequate to explain how life came about. It's got probabilistic, like the gene regulatory network problem I spoke of. And there's one biologist, Shapiro, who he's found that some of the mutations that we say are random mutations are actually purposeful. Like there's a regulatory networks in the genes that can actually go towards a particular outcome due to the environment. Environmental factors will make it react in a determined way. Like it's like there's an intelligence, kind of, you can say, choosing which genes are selected for or are copied, because that's needed for the environment, which kind of takes a lot of the evidence away from them. So they tried to come up with an alternative theory of how life came about, or what the diversity of life came about, other than mutation selection. And various things were offered, and they weren't satisfied with any of it, and they went away having discussed a bunch of the problems and offered no solutions. But they don't tell the public these things. Yeah, is that all right? So the question is, are their conclusions skewed by presuppositions? So a presupposition would be an a priori philosophical commitment. So, a practical example might be, you have a business partner. Your business partner is a good person. They care about you. You can trust them. You're going to make a lot of money with them. Then the evidence comes along that the person's cheating you. But your a priori assumption wins the cognitive dissonance battle. And you ignore all of the evidence that this person's actually cheating you. And then only when it's all over and you can no longer deny that you were cheated are you able to recognize all the evidence that you should have seen. And something similar can happen with relationships. If somebody's in an abusive relationship, they just won't see it because they don't want to. So religious people are accused of having presuppositions, and it's pretty clear you can accuse them of that because they've got a belief and they want it to be true, right? We've all got beliefs and we want our beliefs to be true, unless you're depressed. You've got beliefs and you don't want them to be true. But that's another thing. So everybody's got that. But the problem is when we do science, we should set that aside and follow the evidence where it leads. So there's nothing wrong with having things that you believe that you want to be true. That's fine. The problem is if you're letting that taint your ability to look at the world objectively. I'll play another video now. I think videos make it more exciting, right?
You want to hear something silly? Bears can't parallel park. You want to hear something even sillier? Darwin thought that bears could turn into whales. Back in the 1800s, when Darwin first published The Origin of Species, this is exactly what he said. And he was brutally mocked by scientists of his day for thinking something so ridiculous. He even retracted the idea from later editions of his book. But here's the kicker. Scientists of today think essentially the same thing. Stupid Darwin thinks bears could have turned into whales. How ridiculous. Everyone knows these wolf, pig, weasel, hippo things are turned into whales. My, how the tables have turned. Back in the 80s and the 90s, a series of fossils were found that rocked the evolutionary landscape. Paleontologists thought that they had found a clear transitional series of fossils documenting the evolution of whales. University of Chicago evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne says in his book Why Evolution is True, whales happen to have an excellent fossil record, courtesy of their aquatic habits and robust, easily fossilized bones. This is one of our best examples of an evolutionary transition. Wow, one of the best. Let's take a look at the story behind whale evolution. Is it a good argument or not? So according to Coyne, whale evolution is such great evidence since we have a chronologically ordered series of fossils. And it goes something like this. The sequence begins with a raccoon-sized animal called Indohyus, living 48 million years ago. 52 million years ago, we see a wolf-sized creature called Pakicetus, which is a bit more whale-like than Indohyus. At 50 million years ago, there's the remarkable Ambulocetus. Rhodocetus, 47 million years ago, is even more aquatic. Finally, at 40 million years ago, we find the fossils of Basilosaurus and Dorodon, before we have our modern whales. Let's take a look a little bit closer at this chronologically ordered series of fossils. If you're paying attention, you might be thinking something fishy is going on here, but no, you'd be wrong. That would not be a bad pun because whales are mammals, not fish. But also, yes, something mammally was going on here. Granting the standard Darwinian dates for these fossils, Indohyus is dated as far younger than his supposed descendants, and he's not the only one, more on that later. This is common practice in evolutionary analysis, to ignore where species actually show up in the fossil record and place them wherever makes Darwinian sense, creating what are called chronological inversions, or ghosts. Oh, that's so spooky. The fossil record often reveals fossils out of the order that they're supposed to be in. For just a couple of other examples, let's take a look at bird evolution. It's supposed to go with theropod dinosaurs evolving into birds, with the fossil Archaeopteryx being evidence of this as an intermediate fossil. But the problem is he appears long before the dinosaurs he was supposed to have descended from. Evolution also got a big stick in its spokes with this guy, Tiktaalik, a fish-like creature that was for years crowned as the smoking gun transitional fossil of fish starting to go from the sea to the land. Brilliant evidence, just what they expected. Until in 2010, fossil footprints of true tetrapods were found in Poland, long before they were supposed to have evolved. And all of a sudden, Tiktaalik was dethroned as a transitional fossil because, again, the dates are all out of order. Hey, everybody, I'd like you to meet my grandpa. Oh, so cute. Is that his name, or... No, his name is Seymour. He is my grandpa. What? It doesn't make any sense. Back to the chronologically ordered series of fossils, the Basilosaurus and Dorodon are considered fully aquatic whales. They're not a transition to anything. Okay, maybe they're just trying to pad their numbers a little bit. Big deal.
Sure.
Surely the rest of the fossils are intermediate and transitional, right? Well, that depends on how you define intermediate. In paleontology, intermediate doesn't mean what we think it means. Like my parents are intermediate between me and my Gam Gam and Pop Pop. Oh, hello, sweetie. Hi, Gam Gam. Oh, my, how tall you've grown. Ah, but you're so skinny. Would you like your Gam Gam to make you a nice pot pie? You know, staying healthy. By intermediate, paleontologists usually mean a fossil is merely morphologically intermediate. In other words, if a fossil has features of a supposed ancestor and descendant, then it is classified as an intermediate or transitional fossil. But with that definition, I would be a morphological intermediate between this jockey and this professional basketball player. But that doesn't say anything about lineage, whether I'm an ancestor or descendant of either one. We could be completely unrelated, or even chronologically out of order. That wouldn't matter. The very thing they're trying to prove, the ancestral relationship, or how they came about, is pure assumption. This is how they can say there's tons of intermediate fossils and being technically correct, while at the same time skeptics can say, yeah, there aren't really any intermediate fossils, and also be correct. The fossil evidence is so meager that Darwinists, in order to prove evolutionary ancestry, they have to use a slippery definition that no one would accept in other areas of life. But for the sake of argument, let's ignore that problem because there's another one. Is there even enough time for the transition from land to water to hypothetically take place? Again, taking the standard evolutionary numbers for granted, we've got about 8 to 10 million years to go from the land mammal Pakicetus to fully aquatic whales. It sure seems like a whole lot of time. It's almost enough time for me to watch a Lord of the Rings marathon with someone who has a really small bladder. But is it enough time for whales to have evolved? The field of population genetics is devoted to calculating how long something like this would take. In the past, it was assumed that this was relatively simple to do, as easy as falling off a log. But more recently, scientists at Cornell University calculated how long it would take for different organisms to evolve 2 simple beneficial mutations. For fruit flies with their relatively large population sizes and speedy generation times, it'd only take a few million years for 2 mutations to become fixed. For larger mammals like humans, who have much smaller population sizes and longer generation times, they calculated it would take over 200 million years. Again, that's only for 2 beneficial mutations. Okay, so where would whales and their supposed ancestors fall on that timescale? They're not as quick to reproduce as flies, but quicker than humans. So for 2 simple beneficial mutations, that's supposed to take roughly 43.3 million years. So the evidence shows, using their own assumptions and calculations, that they don't even have 1/4 of the time needed for even 2 simple mutations. And it takes quite a lot of changes to go from the land to the water, it turns out, including some of these lovely attributes. So, how many mutations does it take to change a Pacus? Ooh, I know this joke. 3. 1 to hold it and 2 to turn the ladder. How many mutations does it take to change a Pakicetus to a whale? Not where I would have gone with that joke, but what do I know? To put that in context, take giraffes and their derpy little short-necked pals, the okapi. They're quite similar, and a recent paper studied their differences and found, surprisingly, 70 different genes that likely contributed to the giraffe's appearance. If animals that similar required 70 gene changes for basically just a longer neck and stronger heart, it's a pretty safe bet that animals as different as Pakicetus and whales would require at least as many, and more likely many thousands more. But it gets worse. Recently, a new basilosaurid fossil was found in Antarctica that, even using the most generous dates for Darwinists, cuts down the time available for the whale transition to about half of the already not enough time of 8 million years, and could even place fully aquatic whales before Rhodocetus, before Ambulocetus, and contemporary with, or even before Pakicetus, destroying the entire fossil timeline. So is the whale transitional fossil series any good? Well, once you take into account the padding of their numbers, the chronological inversions, the ghost lineages, more recent fossil finds that discredit the timeline, and their creative use of definitions for what it even means to be a transitional fossil, the mathematical problems using their own numbers, they're all very clever tricks. But once you see how all of this works, it's quite a bit less impressive. To be fair, scientists aren't doing this maliciously. They really believe that evolution is just obviously true. So they reason whether we have 8 million years or 4 million years, lots of fossils or no fossils. If evolution is true and we have whales today, then they must have been able to evolve, regardless of any problems that pop up. But if you don't presuppose evolution, if you treat it as a hypothesis rather than an assumption, then problems like these become far more difficult to hand-wave away. So these fossil finds certainly are interesting and worth debating, but there's a lot more to it than the uncritical, glossy, one-sided story being told. If this is one of the best evidences for evolution, what does that mean for their other evidence that's not as good?
So that's an example of that shows how they have presuppositions which are not necessarily supported by the data. So with the fossil example, they don't really worry about where they find the fossil in the strata and the date which they should deduce based on that. They worry about whether something appears to be intermediate, which yeah, I mean, if you work with something as an assumption, in logic, you'll have, say 2 premises and a conclusion. And like you can say, I can't think of one right now, but if if you come to a conclusion which doesn't work, you'll say there's something wrong with the premises or the argument. Or you'll say, no, our presupposition must be wrong. This conclusion is definitely true. So if your presupposition is that Darwinian evolution is true, anytime you see evidence that doesn't fit that, you just ignore it. So we have various cognitive biases, and we can approach science like that, but then it's no longer science. So like the whale example is a pretty striking example. The mathematician David Belinsky once started counting the different features that whales have versus land mammals. He got to 50,000, and then he stopped counting. Like their skin, their blubber, their shape, and so many things. He detailed it all and got to 50,000 and gave up. If you want to think that 50,000 changes can happen in, I can't remember the number, a couple million years, when the math tells us that you need a lot longer than that just to get 2 changes, then you're, as one person said it, if you want to believe things which are highly improbable to happen, have happened, that's fine, but why call it science?
Is this considering a constant mutation rate? Or
Well, one Dembski, I can't remember his full name. He calculated that from the time of like say the Big Bang till now, we got 14 billion years, and then the speed of light dictates the maximum speed at which things can happen. So we took the speed of light as the maximum speed, and then you assume every atom in the entire universe was fully dedicated to producing combinations of amino acids. Then you get a probabilistic resource that you come up with as 10 to the power of 139, which is a pretty big number, but that's making ridiculous assumptions. Like, that's way too generous. And then you get the probability of one amino acid being 1 in 10 to the 72nd, like a functional protein. But then there's another problem, which is where's this apparatus which is spitting out proteins? Like you go gambling and the odds are stacked against you. The house always wins at the end of the day. But at least you've got some chance because you've got a roulette wheel that spins, and it can land on your number multiple times in a row. So it's not impossible. But if you don't, like there's one analogy that was given to throwing dice. Like say you ask people to have a set of 2 dice, and they want to throw 6 times in a row. and you figure out the probability, right? It could take a long time. But now you say the dice are made of chocolate, and there's a different, color on them that makes up the numbers. And after you've thrown them a few hundred times, they'll melt. Now what are the chances? So this is actually the situation for abiogenesis, because there's synthetic chemists, and they produce nanotechnology. So they make like little tiny cars that when you shine UV light on it, it activates and does things. And they can make medical technology with this. They can do really cool things. But when they do that, they're basically working at the molecular level. They're binding like tiny molecules together, and like the best scientists we have can barely do this stuff. It's so hard and so difficult, and everything's working against you. But basically, like the procedures for making something like that would be like you put it at this temperature for 10 hours, and then another temperature for 5 hours, and then once you get to that stage, you have to purify. So you have to you've got all these reactions that have happened. They've produced the molecules you want, and they've also produced a lot of molecules that you don't want. And if you leave it there, they'll start interacting with one another, and all the molecules you do want will be destroyed. So they have to purify, which means they use other agents, or somehow they do it, and they remove the unwanted stuff. And then sometimes they get like, all the way to the end of the process, and they don't have enough material. So then they have to have a lab notebook where they've kept track of everything they did. They go back to the beginning, and they follow that entire procedure from the beginning. Naturalism did not have a lab notebook. Like you get to that. So, and as soon as you produce, like they've done these abiogenesis experiments where they try to produce like different parts of the cell, and they'll produce something which is basically, it's like comparing garbage bags to a horse. Like they say, we've got, something mimicking a cell or some component of a cell here. And if you look at that compared to a real living organism, it's garbage to horses. And they'll say, now we produce this thing. And then they'll move to the next step. And when they move to the next step, they won't use the garbage they produced in the first step. They'll use much better stuff. I don't know the details how they do. I could play a clip of an actual scientist talking about it, or I can just share a link. I think we're running out of time. So that's the point. There's not a mechanism in place to produce these things. So even when they do these ridiculous, generous calculations of what the chances are, still it betrays credulity to believe that's what actually happened. I mean, we have a sample of one. It's not like we could start the universe again and watch and see if life can come about by chance. All we can do is historical science. We can look backwards and assume, which comes back to a point I was getting at earlier, and then I went off on a tangent, which was evolution. So they say, with the alphabet soup example, the kid knows that his mum could have done that. But there's a cause that we know exists, which is capable of arranging letters on the dining table. But we don't know that there's an intelligence that has the power of creating life. But it's, again, then I talked about gene regulatory networks and how we've never seen evolution taking place. What we have seen is minor variations within existing organisms. And that's not the same thing. So you can get what's called an ambiguity fallacy, which is where you use the same word to mean two different things. So, like, look, I can use evolution to produce more furry sheep. Therefore, I've proven evolution. Now that evolution's proven, we know that these ancient raccoons turned into whales. Like, no, all you've proven is that you can make sheep that are more furry than other sheep. You haven't proven that you could turn a sheep into a donkey or anything like that, because they're different things. And when we genetically examine what's actually going on in these beneficial mutations, we see that most of the time what's happening is the genes are being broken. So when a bacteria becomes immune to an antibiotic, they look at it and there's a gene or a couple of genes which were broken, because if there's a certain outcome you need to achieve, and there'll be 1,000 ways you can do it by destroying information. But say there's a sentence in a story and you want that sentence gone. You can have print errors which produce a book where that sentence is replaced by gibberish, and you've achieved your purpose. That sentence is now gone. But if you want to do it in such a way where you insert a new sentence which is intelligible and fits the storyline, the chances of that happening are far less. So when Darwin came up with this theory, we didn't know any of this stuff. They thought a simple cell was simple. Now we know there's no such thing as a simple organism. They're super complicated. So yeah, that's the point. The Darwinian evolution is invoking a cause which nobody's seen happening. So if you want to say you can't invoke a cause which we don't know exists or is capable of doing that, then you've got to apply the same argument to Darwinian evolution. Otherwise, it's called being biased or favoring one side and not the other. Where any argument we give to debunk what particular hypothesis should be also applied to the hypothesis which is being defended. So the video kind of covered these points on this slide. Then we've got comparative morphology, which is given as an example. So they talk about how, there's a bone here, a couple of bones there, some little bones, and then some longer bones. You get the same thing there. One bone, two bones, little bones, some longer bones. It's the same thing in all of these, and you see it in all sorts of organisms. They say this means common ancestry. And the problem with this argument, I should have made a slide for it, is I can go to a Ford dealer, or you go through a history of Ford cars, and you say, this is the one that came out with in 1960 and 1961 and you go through the whole progression of, let's say, Ford Mustangs. They went through an ugly period in the 90s, and then they sort of made them look good again at some stage. And you say, look, this shows they've evolved because there's a gradual progression and there's similarities going backwards. And then you look at other cars and you say, oh, they've got a lot in common. They've got an engine, chassis, gearbox, and so on. But the problem is this here can be done by a designer just as readily as it can be done by a natural process. So any piece of evidence which is equal evidence for both sides is evidence for neither. So if they want to, anyway, it's just not evidence. It's kind of taking something that fits their story and claiming that it's evidence because it fits their story. But if it also fits a lot of other stories, then it's not evidence for their story. Like we could use another crime scene analogy that there could be various different stories about what happened, and if you have a piece of evidence that fits all of them, then that piece of evidence isn't going to help you select one of them over the other. So that's all the content that I prepared. Any questions? But, yeah.
When do you believe, we know that there was a time when humans didn't exist, but prehistoric creatures did exist. So this higher creature that maybe exists or not, whatever, had to create humans or other kinds of animals that exist now at one certain point of time. Do you, I don't know, what do you believe, when was this point? Do you believe that humans evolved from monkeys at all, or do you believe we were created as humans directly?
Yeah, so I believe humans came into existence as they are, or more advanced than they are. There's evidence for devolution, that things become more degraded over time. With science, you can only go so far in answering these questions. And a lot of the assumptions will be somewhat specious, meaning that the evidence is not so great. So that is the standard account is that humans came to appear at some point. As for whether we could have evolved from monkeys, I would need to see evidence that you can have changes to gene regulatory networks. You can have genetic mutations which are capable of affecting body plans. before I could accept that we evolved from monkeys. If every change that's ever been witnessed, even in fruit flies, which acts on the level necessary for creating novel body plans, is fatal, then there's no reason to think that's possible. You know, you need like with the intelligent design thing, we know an intelligent mind, like, you know, we're working from causes now in operation. We know intelligent minds are capable of arranging information in like you have integrated complexity. So you could have like a mousetrap is given as an example of irreducible complexity, or a bicycle. Let's say you were going to take a bicycle and turn it into a motorbike by making gradual changes, but at every step you needed to have an operational transportation device. So if you took the chain off, you still needed to have a bike that you could get you from A to B before you put the stronger chain on. And you just can't. I mean, sure you could have like a change that only happens to the chain, but like with gene regulatory networks, you have a change that says use these proteins here that are coded on the DNA here, and use them to build this. So if you change that and you say instead of using those ones, or instead of using those ones here, use them there, but you haven't changed the information that's there. It's like if you have instructions that says, you know, take this part and put it there. And if you want to change, if you've got something different you're building, you need to take a different part. So you need to have instructions that say, take this different part, which is now coded for, and build that there. So you need two changes that need to happen simultaneously. And it gets to a point where it becomes mathematically impossible. And so all the mutations that we talked about, like I spoke about how they work by breaking genes, so like a dog with a sort of snout, like the variations in dog breeds, they create evolutionary dead ends. Like I can't remember, is it like wolves or something that are the origin of all dogs? So you can take whichever one it is, and you can produce all variety of dog species. But you can't take a poodle and produce a wolf. It creates a dead end. And this is because it happens by breaking genes. So you have to start with something more sophisticated using this process, and then you can get various changes. Because, yeah, basically it's breaking information rather than building it up. So we don't have sufficient examples. Like, you know, 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have this information about what genetic changes are actually happening when mutations occur. We just knew like, oh, well, this sheep's more furry than the other one. But now we can actually look at it and say, in order for that bacteria to become antibiotic resistant, this is the difference in its DNA code. And you can say what's happened is that the functional code's been replaced with gibberish. And that's what makes it resistant to the antibiotics. So you can't, you know, go around destroying things and expect to turn a monkey into a human. And then that's one thing. Another point is there's a book called Forbidden Archaeology, where these two people decided they were going to examine whether there was fossils which fit the Vedic picture, because the Vedas talk about humans existing for hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years. And so they thought, well, you know, it's interesting that we don't see them. You know, like you could say, oh, people were more sophisticated back there, and then they just burned all their bones. They'd had cremation rather than burial, and that's why we don't find bones. But they thought they'd just look, and they investigated. So they went back to like 100-year-old, you know, like the oldest things they could, and they looked at original source. Like they look at like Nature, which is a really prominent science journal, and they looked at it like 100 years ago, and they found people reporting, you know, finding human skeletons, and then they looked at it was reported where the skeleton was found in the strata, and they went and, you know, like there were different reports they get of coins being found or a gold chain being found in coal. And they'd look at either the date was given there, or if it wasn't given, it was just said, we found it in the strata. And then they'd go to the local geological survey and ask them, what date do you give to the strata? And they'd say, oh, that's 2 million years. So it's like, okay, well, we've got a 2 million year old anatomically modern human skeleton now. And so they've had, yeah. Oh, sorry. So they did something at a conference and had something published, and they wrote this huge book. And a lot of their book was actually not trying to prove human antiquity, but trying to prove that the way data is handled among scientists is problematic, because you get what's called a data filter. So basically, these reports from 100 years ago, you'll see a certain pattern of like, you know, ancient humans and different things. But then at a certain point, those things are no longer getting reported. And you even have stories of people having their whole careers ruined because they reported finding an arrowhead that was 250,000 years old. And that date got retracted, and now they're saying it was 40,000 years old. It's highly politicized.
So you share the belief, as you were saying a few minutes ago, that like do you share the belief as religion that something external created the human?
Yeah.
That like what designer like this?
That's, yeah, basically you can infer from the science, yeah, an intelligent design behind existence. Yeah. I mean, you can't really prove more than that. Like with science, you can prove there's something else going on here, but you can't prove theological claims. Like you can't jump from that to therefore Christianity is true, because it's not something where science can penetrate. It's a theological subject. So so with science you can say it's smart to ask these questions. Whereas currently the story is Darwinian evolution is a fact. We've proven it. Therefore, if you don't believe it and if you think religion is true, there's something wrong with you. Whereas what we can show with the science is actually there's reason to believe there's something going on beyond just what we see in the material world and with our senses. There's something behind this all, and that just brings up questions. Like then you can look at Bhagavad Gita or Bhagavatam or wherever you want to go with your questioning. You know, you can't. Those questions don't prove that you should consult Bhagavad Gita. You could just as well go and look at the Bible or the Quran or Buddhist mysticism or any other thing. Or, you know, meditate in your heart and see if answers come to you. All of those questions are left open by science. But currently, mainstream science is claiming we've closed those questions, don't even ask them, which it's philosophically absurd too, because science, you know, philosophy and science are kind of different realms, so you can't prove with science that there's nothing beyond. Anything else?
What about something so simple as someone supposedly remembered in past life?
Yeah, well, there's the famous, well, maybe it should be famous, but it's not, research of Dr. Ian Stevenson, who he gave evidence for reincarnation, and he didn't like past life regressions or any of that stuff because it's too suggestive. He liked to take children, like they were between the ages of 3 and 5 generally, who had spontaneous remembrances of past lives. So nobody was putting this idea in the head that they lived before and asking them questions and they were just dreaming it up. They were spontaneously saying, I'm having these dreams, I remember this. This person was my wife or husband. This person was my mommy and daddy. This is how I died. And there was even one case where the kid's like, this is where the treasure's buried. And they took that kid and dug up the treasure. And so stuff like that gets pretty striking. And so he made it mathematically too. Like the kid would have a scar that matched a wound that caused death in the previous life, and they'd like a birthmark, sorry, not a scar. So he'd map the body with like little squares to give probabilities. You know, like birthmarks can happen anywhere, and then look at the location of the wound. You know, this person would say this was my name, and they'd go and track down that person and look at how they died, and it's the same story and the names of the people and the same people. Like, there's no way the kid could possibly know the names of all these people and how this person died, based on purely on materialistic explanations. So then, and then he adds to it, you know, that the chances of a birthmark being in the exact, same region as the death wound. Anyway, so that's another research that can be looked at, which shows this another example of science showing there's something beyond what we experience with our senses. You have to go outside the room in order to explain what's in here, which then again it brings questions. Vedanta Sutra starts by saying Atato Brahma Jigyasa, which direct translation is therefore inquire into spiritual subjects, and therefore means now that you have this human form of life. But you know, the basic point is it starts with inquiry. You have to be curious, and to do that, we have to think that these questions are intelligent, because you know, like everybody goes through their life and thinks maybe there's something more, maybe there's something beyond all this. But not everybody actually goes to investigate that. Many people will just push it back down and then go on with their life, acting as if this is all there is. And then, of course, you get Pascal's wager, which is, you know, if there is nothing beyond this, then it doesn't really matter whether you investigate or not. It does matter whether you investigate in a fanatical way, which makes your life terrible now. Nobody should follow a so-called spiritual path which makes your life miserable now or anybody else's life miserable now. Spiritual path, whether it's true or not, should be beneficial now. So there's nothing to lose when you have that criteria by exploring whether the stuff's true. there's only something to gain. And then, of course, even if it's not true, people find it's beneficial. And then you have the added possibility it's true, which brings in even more potential benefit. So asking questions and investigating these bigger questions about why we're here and what's beyond and so on is intelligent no matter how you look at it. We're probably supposed to finish, eh?
No, but those are nice questions.
Okay, anything else? I've told them it's over. Everyone just wants to eat now, eh?
The motivated me.
Okay, cool. Thanks for coming and your kind attention.
Thank you.